Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. On today's show, we dive into weather's role in the devastating global pandemic of 1918. Plus, in our What If segment, we explore how life and wars may have changed if the pandemic never happened. And we examine two of the most studied phenomena in weather today. $500 million people infected, an estimated death toll between 50 to 100 million. The 1918 flu pandemic remains the deadliest plague in modern history. As this unknown virus spread to a third of the world's population, health officials raced to find a cause and the cure. Did the cooling climate of the time contribute to the worldwide transmission of this insidious virus? It's just one of the truly fascinating stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, when climate and weather shaped history. Joining me now to delve deeper into the 1918 flu pandemic is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Joel.
My pleasure, as always.
All right, let's talk about it. The 1918 flu pandemic, or as many refer to it as the Spanish flu.
Yeah, it really started developing toward the end of World War I. As you know, the war started in 1914, and then there was the armistice November 11th, 1918, when the war was over. But in 1918, perhaps because of the war and soldiers traveling, the flu developed and spread rapidly. We don't know the origin of it. Some people think it might started at an army base in Kansas. Other people, of course, call it the Spanish flu because they say it must have started in Spain, but probably didn't. It may have started in Europe, where all the soldiers were gathered together in trenches. You know, there's a lot of trench warfare. But in any case, it was a deadly flu that then spread around the world. You had 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population infected, and the death toll, much higher mortality rate, perhaps as high as 50 to 100 million people. We don't have accurate numbers. If it was 100 million, that's 1 in 15 people in the world died from that flu. Of course, you didn't have any vaccines then.
Right.
You didn't have antibiotics then. You didn't have modern communications.
If we don't know where it originated, why was it called the Spanish flu? Why was it given that name?
Well, it's interesting how the press, the influence the press has. Apparently, during the war, there was a lot of censorship in a lot of countries, and it was in nobody's interest, government's interest, let's say not nobody, but the government's interest to talk too much about it and scare the soldiers and so on. So there was a lot of censorship. Spain was not in the war, and so they had more of an open press, and they talked about it because there were cases there and so on. So that's where the news was coming from. But it probably did not originate in Spain.
Why did the flu spread so rapidly and universally?
People don't realize, but there have been hundreds of pandemics throughout history. In China, regional flu outbreaks that were deadly have occurred hundreds of times over the last 2,000 years. So this is a curse on humanity.
It appeared to those that came in waves. It wasn't just one flu, it came in different waves, correct?
Just like the pandemic, the COVID has come in waves. We're still having waves stretching over a longer period of time. But the death rate from COVID is much less. Some of that due to vaccine, some of it due to treatment like Paxlovid and other things we know today, and be able to treat the results. But it was a different flu. In that case, in the Spanish flu, it was most lethal to people aged 25 to 40.
Yeah, and that's interesting. People in their prime, not people that are more susceptible.
Yeah, and the COVID, age 65 and over,
right.
Many of which who perished had a comorbidity. What's interesting too is if you look at life insurance companies today, they're reporting fewer deaths over the last year and a half because people who had a weakness perished because of COVID, and the ones that survived are living longer. So the average age of death has increased since COVID hit its peak.
How did it finally come to an end?
Well, it burned us. Everybody who was exposed to it developed the resistance to it, immunity, I guess. It just, wore itself out. And some people probably had some natural resistance, or others didn't get exposed with less travel. Some parts of the world, people just didn't get the exposure.
Thanks, Joel. We'll speak with you again in just a few minutes. Here with more perspective on the 1918 flu pandemic is John M. Barry, author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
How did the pandemic originate?
Well, and technically, an influenza virus from birds, jump species, it may have gone through another mammal, such as a pig. It's possible that it came directly from birds. There are 8 segments of the influenza virus. We know 7 of them came directly from birds. The 8th may or may not have passed through another mammal. It adapted to humans, and it spread explosively.
Why did it spread so quickly and universally?
Well, basically, the population hadn't seen the virus before, and therefore their immune systems couldn't respond to it. Oddly enough, the elderly seemed to have seen a similar virus, and they were pretty well protected, exactly the reverse of COVID. In terms of lethality, the virus got into the lungs. The immune system overreacted. In terms of the pathogenesis, it was actually a lot like COVID. There was also probably a lot of deaths from bacterial pneumonia. The influenza virus largely wiped out the protections in the respiratory tract, and then bacteria could march pretty easily into the lungs.
Can we compare how many people died from World War I with how many people that died from the influenza pandemic?
Well, the numbers of deaths in the war was horrific, but even with that, the influenza pandemic pretty much dwarfed it.
Were there multiple waves of the influenza?
There were probably 4 waves. The last one was in 1920. After that, the virus pretty much calmed down, partly because people's immune systems had seen it before and they could adjust to it. I also think the virus itself probably mutated in the direction of mildness.
Why did the pandemic end, and was there ever a drug or vaccine developed to fight it?
Well, they didn't even know what a virus was in 1918. So there was no vaccine or drug, and we still don't have really a drug that's effective against influenza. There was a tremendous amount of scientific advances that came out of the study and trying to figure out what happened, ranging from the definition of a virus. Even you can trace the discovery that DNA carries a genetic code, which is obviously one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century. You can trace that actually to the pandemic. It would have happened eventually anyway.
How did the 1918 pandemic compare to COVID overall?
Well, again, the lethality, there's no comparison whatsoever. As I said earlier, if you adjust for population, at least 225 million people would have died if had COVID been as lethal. In terms of impact on other organs, also the 2 viruses were similar.
And was that immunity or the immunity from the 1918 influenza, was that carried forward with individuals and have any impact on COVID?
No, I don't think it had any impact on COVID whatsoever. 2 entirely different viruses, so your immune system is not going to recognize. The immune system is very specific, very much geared toward a particular pathogen. So I don't think there was any benefit from an influenza infection in 1918. And of course, the influenza virus that we still see today, if you get a case, that's actually includes some of the genetic material from the 1918 virus. But obviously, it's no longer anything like the 1918 virus in terms of severity.
John M. Barry, author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Still to come, we explore two of the most studied phenomena in the weather today. But next, it's time for our What If segment. How would life be different if the 1918 flu pandemic never happened? Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. It is time for our segment, What If? And today we're talking about a different look at the 1918 flu pandemic. Joining him again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. All right, let's talk about the flu. Would the recovery of World War I been different or better if the flu didn't exist?
Absolutely. I mean, so the war already taxed a lot of the countries because of the expense of war. And then you had the flu, which significantly impacted in a negative way the GDP and the economy. So both those things happening at once. And maybe that's what set us up for the boom of the 1920s, culminating in 1929 peak and then the crash. So volatility creates more volatility. But yeah, it was a tremendous impact on the world population, and it was much worse overall than what we experienced with COVID. About 8 billion people, only 1/10 of 1% died in COVID. As many as 3 to 5% of the world's population died in the Spanish flu.
Of course, the weather did play a big role in the spreading of the 1918 flu.
We know that a virus thrives on low humidity. It may just be the opposite of what people think, because mold and other things spread in high humidity. But low humidity is favorable for the virus itself. So in a dry environment, which you normally have inside buildings in the wintertime, particularly in 1918, think about it, when it's cold outside, that means the dew point's low. And as the air comes into the buildings heated up, the relative humidity falls and can fall dramatically. On a cold day, the humidity inside can be 10 or 15%. That's one of the reasons we developed in the most recent COVID the idea of indoor humidity. We invented that and we added it to our app so people knew when it was particularly dry. You want to keep the humidity inside your building between 30 and 60%. That caused the spread. People didn't know that then. We were better at it in COVID. And then, of course, the weather patterns also contributed. There was La Nina and then El Nino, which caused a disruption and changed the weather pattern. Some parts of the world was very cold. There was a severe drought in India. The monsoons never set in. So there was crop failures, starvation, and weakening. People weakened, so they're more susceptible to the virus. So the death toll in India, one of the world's most populous countries, could have been as high as 5 or 6 or 7% of the entire population.
Were there any changes after it came to an end that to help track and prevent future pandemics?
Yeah, of course, think about in 1980 there was a lack of communications. There wasn't modern media like we have today. There were no World Health Organizations to cooperate and share numbers. There was no vaccines. We didn't have antibiotics. A lot of progress has been made over the last 100 years, as we've seen with the COVID.
Let's compare the two. Let's compare it again. The 1918 flu compared to our recent pandemic, COVID.
Well, there are estimates, and we don't have accurate numbers, that the death toll globally could have been as high as 3 to as much as 5%. 5%, 1 in 20 people could have died globally from the 1918 flu. In the most recent, the pandemic, 1 in 1,000 people died.
What I find interesting is how quickly the 1918 flu spread when you didn't have the mass transportation, you didn't have the amount of travel that you certainly have today.
Yeah, much more travel in 2021 compared to 103 years earlier. That just says that the Spanish flu must have been extremely contagious, extremely contagious. And of course, it was lethal to ages 25 to 40.
Which is a lot different compared to COVID, which attacked more of the people who were more susceptible, were generally a little, were older or had underlying health conditions.
Yeah,
that's a big difference.
A big difference.
Did the 1918 flu pandemic have any impact on future events?
Well, it might have. It's pure speculation. But we do know that the seeds of World War II, which was the deadliest war in the history of humanity, came out of World War I by the reparations and the penalty on Germany to pay for the damages from the winners said they caused. And as a result, we had the wild inflation in Germany because they couldn't afford it. And that wild inflation caused most of the people to lose everything. So they were mad as heck. And that allowed Hitler to come to power. Without that wild inflation and the terrible losses of the economy that they suffered, we might not have had Hitler or World War II. The pandemic might have contributed to that because it's estimated 400,000 people in Germany died out of a population of about 60 million. It's less than 1%, but still, remember the age is 25 to 40, where most of the people died. They were productive, so a big impact on the economy. At the same time, they had to pay these war reparations. So the productivity of the economy after the war negatively affected, contributing and accelerating. So we can speculate if the pandemic had not occurred, then perhaps the damage to the German economy and the wild inflation that wiped everybody out would not have occurred.
Certainly was a pandemic that is not going to be forgotten over 100 years ago, and we're still talking about it. All right, I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joe Myers, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Bernie, as always.
Right. After the break, we'll examine two of the most studied phenomena in weather today. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. The rapid spread of the 1918 flu pandemic was aided by a climate anomaly known as La Nina. While not much was known about La Nina in the early 1900s, La Nina and its counterpart El Nino are two of the most studied phenomena today. La Nina refers to the periodic cooling of ocean surface temperatures in the central and east central equatorial Pacific. La Nina represents the cool phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation cycle, while the warm phase is known as El Nino. These episodes typically last from 1 to 3 years. During typical conditions in the Pacific Ocean, trade winds blow west along the equator, taking warm water from South America toward Asia. To replace that warm water, cold water rises from the depths, which cools the waters along the west coast of South America. During La Nina events, trade winds are even stronger than usual, pushing more warm water toward Asia. Off the west coast of the Americas, even colder, nutrient-rich water rises to the surface. Now, depending upon the strength of La Nina, its impacts differs from continent to continent and season to season. In North America, the jet stream during the winter months is forced farther north, often resulting in drought across the southern U.S., while heavy rains and flooding occurs in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. Winter temperatures are warmer than historical average in the south and cooler than normal in the north. La Nina has less impacts during the summer, but usually results in a more active Atlantic hurricane season. That's our show for today. For more information and get your copy of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History by Dr. Joe Myers, go to invisibleiceberg.com. And a big thanks to all of you for watching.